Next, we'll hear from a journalist who joined the Los Angeles Times in 1978, covering Central America, the Middle East. He was in New York before moving to the Washington Bureau in 1983, and he was a really influential and remarkable bureau chief there for 13 years before he became Washington columnist for the LA Times, where he's still very active and very well read. Some of you may remember his moderation of a presidential primary debate between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in January 2008, which he pulled off with characteristic professionalism and toughness. And he's also a great friend. Please welcome Doyle McManus.
I'm here, I guess, to talk about the Washington Alissa, the pre-war Alissa, the Alissa who covered mundane beats like Congress, legal affairs, social issues, tobacco, health care. Although she was very creative, if you look in her clips from those years, you will even find stories about poetry and nuns. But for her sins, she also had a hand in covering Bill Clinton's Monica Lewinsky scandal. One of my proudest achievements, actually, in my brief career as a manager was the fact that I got to be the guy who hired Alissa Rubin at the LA Times. It was 1997, and we were looking for someone to cover Congress, but specifically the culture wars, the terrible social issues that were dividing America at the time, especially the bitter battle over restrictions, federal restrictions on abortion. And so we looked around for reporters who had covered this most difficult of all issues sensitively, deeply, and well. We found these wonderful clips from this woman we didn't know named Alissa Rubin, but we asked a reporter who had worked with her, David Willman, one of our investigative reporters, so who is this Alissa Rubin person? And David said, she is the hardest working reporter I know. And since David was the hardest working reporter I knew, that was a pretty good recommendation. But there was one more hurdle. There was a senior editor at the LA Times who was, as it happened, a devout Roman Catholic. And he was keenly sensitive to all of the unconscious biases that can creep into stories about abortion or other social issues. And so we sent him all of Alissa's clips, and we waited and held our breath. And here's what he said. He said, "This woman's work is beautiful. I've read every story she's written, and I still don't know what her personal views are on the subject." Which takes me to a story of Alissa's that I want to quote. An extraordinary 2,000-word story in 1999. She went out to Nebraska to do a piece on the real-life dilemmas of women who find themselves seeking late-term abortions. It was a big issue at the time. It's still a big issue today. And she wrote about three women, real women, women named Wendy and Crystal and Elena. And here's a little of what she wrote. For the Wendys, the Crystals, and Elenas, all the choices are bleak. They come to one of the few physicians in a 4-state area who is willing to perform abortions up to the 24th week of pregnancy. Crystal came 4 hours from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The clinic is bright and the surgical rooms are clean. In the waiting room, a television set blares. Most of the women wear jeans and sweatshirts that hide their bellies. There are a few boyfriends or husbands, but most have come alone. The waiting room faces a nurse's station where a price list is taped to the plexiglass window. An abortion at 12 weeks or less costs $320, 15 weeks, $500, 19 weeks, $900, 22 weeks, $1,850. For many women, collecting that money delays the procedure. And by the time they finally get enough money together to pay for an abortion at the local clinic, it's too late. That story, that price list on the plexiglass window, has stayed in my memory for 15 years. It's one of those stories that stays with you. But the most important thing in that story, and I think the most important thing, the most important element in Alissa's work, isn't just that keen reporter's eye that saw that list and the story it would tell, although that helps. The most important element, I think, is empathy. What we try to do as reporters when we do our jobs as John Chancellor wanted us to do them is we try to illuminate the world's dark places. And to illuminate them, first we have to understand them. And one way to understanding, and maybe even the best way to understanding, is through empathy. And I believe that is what has distinguished Alissa's work most for 40 years, from Wichita to Washington to Baghdad and Kabul. I visited Alissa in Kabul a few years ago, and after a long dinner, I told her, "You know, you've been covering wars for 10 years now. You don't have to keep coming back." And she looked at me with that painfully direct gaze and said, "I know that, but I feel I have an obligation to these people." It is an honor and a privilege to have such a person as a colleague and a friend.